Welcome to the Hyphen, Indian American Dialogues. Joining us today is Milan Vaishnav. He is the head of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. He's a leading expert in the political economy of India as well as the Indian diaspora. He is the author of an award-winning book on politics and crime in India. He's also the host of an incredible podcast called Grand Tamasha. He has a PhD in political science from Columbia. Milan joins us today to talk about the Indian American Attitude Survey. This Carnegie Endowment survey questioned 1,000 Indian Americans on a variety of topics. What's exciting about this survey is that given the number of people surveyed and its methodology, we're able to draw statistically significant conclusions about the Indian American population. Welcome, Milan.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So this survey is quite exciting. It's methodologically robust with over 1,000 or about 1,000 Indian Americans surveyed. You can make significant, statistically significant conclusions about attitudes. I'm quite excited to talk about it today. What I wanted to start with is just to ask you, what are the biggest takeaways from the survey? What should people know about the Indian American community based on your findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would kind of break down, I think, our core findings into a couple different categories, right? I mean, I think the first and clearest takeaway for us is that, Indian Americans have a largely negative perception about how Donald Trump has handled his first year in office. And that negative perception is pretty broad and extends to his handling of the domestic economy, his handling of international economic policy, his handling of immigration, as well as his handling of U.S.-India relations, right? So that's, I think, the first top line finding. The second is that when it gets to, okay, so what does that mean for their kind of political decision making? It is true that Indian Americans remain disproportionately democratic in the big D sense, right? Favor the Democratic Party. But their attachment to the party has weakened between 2020 and 2026, right? And Republican identifiers has grown a little bit, but actually the biggest growth has been amongst people who are kind of identify as independents, right? So they're expressing some kind of dissatisfaction with kind of both major political parties. And so one implication of that is that when you ask people about kind of how they would vote in an actual election, and if you were just to take the 2024 election as an example and kind of do a rerun of that, you don't actually see the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris doing much better. In fact, the vote shares for Trump and for Harris come down, and the number of people who say, I don't really want to vote for either of these candidates goes up, right? That's really, I think, the core kind of political findings. The other thing, two things I would highlight are one having to do with discrimination, that the report does not, surprisingly to us, detect a statistically significant increase in the share of Indian Americans who have first-person experiences with discrimination on the basis of, their skin color, their country of origin, their gender, their caste, their religion. However, they do report witnessing a lot of online vitriol targeting Indian Americans. And one of the things the survey uncovers is that this is leading perhaps people to preemptively disengage from the kind of civic and political life in the United States, right? So just because we haven't picked up a statistical uptick in discrimination doesn't mean that discrimination isn't having all kinds of negative impacts. And then the last thing, if I might just highlight, which I thought was kind of interesting, is, there are increasingly a number of prominent people of Indian origin who are engaged in our politics, right? And one of the people who has really, I think, captured people's attention is the new New York City mayor, Zohran Mamdani, who is the child of Indian origin immigrants. And what we find is that actually 7 out of 10 Indian Americans are enthusiastic about Mamdani's election, right? And Mamdani, of course, is famously a democratic socialist. He is, part of the progressive left. Indian Americans tend to be pretty centrist in their ideological orientation, but there's something about Mamdani that has clearly captured their imagination. And so I think that was just a final thing that we found very interesting. I think something to watch in the future. Clearly, this is somebody with a lot of political skill, and a lot of political ambition.
What motivated you to do this survey that many people haven't thought of before?
First of all, thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be with you again. So this project actually dates back to the year 2020, and it came out of a conversation that I was having with 2 of my friends and collaborators, Devesh Kapoor, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and Sumitra Badrinathon, who at the time was at the University of Pennsylvania. She's now at American University. And Devesh is a longtime scholar of diasporas generally, and the Indian diaspora specifically. He and his co-authors wrote a terrific book that came out in 2016 called The Other 1%, which I think is still the best kind of empirical data-driven look at Indians in America writ large. And, the 3 of us, all Indian origin people living in the United States, just, had a lot of questions about this group, our community, their voting behavior, their connections to India, their kind of lived social realities. And I think the kind of trigger to decide to really do a survey was, if you go back to 2020, President Trump was in office. And there was this question about, whether or not we would see a kind of significant movement of Indian Americans away from the Democratic Party, which has been their traditional home, towards the Republican Party, because Donald Trump was really courting Indian Americans. You will remember in 2019, he famously held that Howdy Modi rally in Houston, Texas, where he appeared on stage with the Indian Prime Minister, with a kind of adoring group of 55,000 Indian Americans in a football stadium in Houston. And there was a concern that I think the Republican Party had sort of put out there that, if a Biden-Harris administration were to come to power, this would not be great for U.S.-India relations or for the community. And so it was a question. People were talking about it. And we decided, let's try and field a survey to see if we could kind of assess that. But while we're at it, let's also try to get better a grounding of how Indian Americans think about the huge transformations underway in India's own politics, and maybe ask a little bit about their own kind of questions or relations to their own identity, what they think about kind of what it means to be Indian American. And so that's really what got the ball rolling. So that fast forward to today, the survey that you mentioned is actually the 3rd in a series. We did a survey in 2020. We did one again in 2024 before that year's presidential election. And now this one that we just did, the survey itself was in the field in December and January. And we just put out the report in late February.
So what were your most surprising findings in this survey? You say it's the 3rd compared, potentially to the prior 2.
So maybe I'll just give a little bit of context here. We decided to do the survey at this time for a particular reason. It's not close to an election. The midterms are still many months away. But I think there was a feeling that, look, we're approaching the end of the first year of the second Trump administration, and it's been in some ways a head-spinning year. And it's been a head-spinning year for India, for Indians, and for Indian Americans, right? I mean, we've seen, as you know, Sital, a lot of turbulence in the U.S.-India relationship. on account of tariffs, on account of immigration policy, Trump's involvement in the conflict between India and Pakistan. At the same time, we have seen, and there have been lots of reporting on this, a documented spike in anti-Indian, anti-Indian American sentiment online, a general feeling that this is a time of kind of unease. There's a political backdrop to the story that we were also interested in. I mentioned earlier that Indian Americans have traditionally been one of the most loyal constituencies within the Democratic Party. And that shifted a bit between 2020 and 2024. So the way to think about it is in 2020, about 70% of Indian Americans, according to our data, voted for the Democrat Joe Biden, who ended up winning that election. About 20% voted for Donald Trump, who was the incumbent who lost that election. Fast forward to 2024, and that 70-20 Democratic Party advantage shrank to 60-30, right? So it went from net 50 to net 30. So in other words, a 10 percentage point swing away from the Democrats towards the Republicans. So, we wanted to do this survey to see, has anything changed given all of this turbulence in the past year? So sorry for that kind of throat clearing, but I think it's important to kind of understand where we're coming from. So what were we surprised by? We're surprised by, I think, something that seems somewhat paradoxical, right? On the one hand, Indian Americans offer a hugely negative assessment of Trump's second term, right? So 1 year into his second term, large majorities of Indian Americans disapprove of his job performance, are unhappy with his handling of the economy, are upset about his immigration policies. 7 out of 10 Indian Americans we surveyed report being dissatisfied, right? So that's a very strong disapproval rating. It's much higher than obviously the national average. At the same time, we don't see yet that widespread disapproval of Trump's policies neatly translating into clear gains for Democrats. If anything, we're actually seeing something of a softening of Indian Americans' own partisan attachment to the Democratic Party. And when you ask them about kind of a hypothetical election, say if you were to redo the 2024 election where we had Vice President Kamala Harris on the ballot on one side and the Democratic Party and Donald Trump, how would you vote? And frankly, fewer people would vote for Trump and for Harris. And there's a big increase in the number of people who are unhappy with both candidates, right? So this has not led to kind of mechanical Democratic gain. So I think that for us was the biggest takeaway. And I think we were somewhat surprised that there wasn't this kind of reflexive move back to the Democratic Party.
That's interesting. And I think it also reflects some of the dynamics we're seeing in the United States generally. In particular, you found that, Indian American men were more likely to favor Trump. And that is, of course, generally men have moved towards Trump across America. And plus what you're saying, the lack of enthusiasm for Democrats is we actually don't have a candidate yet who, we don't have one identified because we're not close to a presidential election, close enough. And so I don't think we have a candidate that inspires people yet. Right.
But totally right. I mean, I think, look, part of this, and we have to be very transparent and upfront about this, is the fact that, we are doing this survey at a time when we're not on the eve of a major election. And as you rightly said, if we were to redo this in a couple of years when there are a set of Democratic candidates out there who are contesting the presidential primary, or indeed an eventual nominee, we might have a very different story, right? But I do think this survey is picking up something, as you alluded to, that is present in the larger body politic, which is there are a lot of people unhappy with this president, unhappy with the decisions he's making, unhappy with the turn that the Republican Party has made with the MAGA movement. But they are not yet sold on the Democrats as a viable alternative. I think they might be in a bit of a wait and see mode to see who emerges, right?
One thing that I found interesting about whom you surveyed was that it includes both sort of U.S. born Indian Americans, foreign born who may be non-citizens, and some of whom may be citizens. Plus, you added this year multiracial groups, and one of at least one of which must identify as Indian. So, how does that affect some of your results in particular questions? I think it might have some impact.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I mean, I think one decision we made, and we have some language about this in the report, is that we adjusted the sample somewhat to account for the fact that we are seeing more interracial marriage in the Indian community, right? And this is something that's kind of clear from census data. The overall numbers are still pretty low. I mean, in fact, even relative to other Asian origin groups, Indian Americans tend to marry less outside of their community, but still, it's something that is becoming more prevalent. And so we adjusted the kind of screening mechanism for people who could take the survey to allow for a greater number of those people, because we do think that segment is going to grow over time. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious in trying to make comparisons over time, right? Because the makeup of the sample is going to be sort of slightly different. We also, as you rightly pointed out, include, and we've always done this, citizens as well as non-citizens. For the questions that we ask about vote choice, obviously the analysis restricts those to people who are just citizens, because they're the people who are eligible to vote. But we think it's important for a whole variety of reasons to also get a sense of how non-citizens are thinking about politics and life, and because they do matter, their voices matter. Obviously, they're important kind of economic actors. They're important members of local communities all around the country. And frankly, right, given the numbers of Indian Americans, many of those people are becoming citizens and becoming naturalized. And so, we didn't want to kind of exclude those people from the sample.
Right. So, like, for example, some questions I think, might come out differently would be the particular question you asked about whether the respondents care about sort of India-US relations. And it was surprising to me. I mean, maybe not surprising, but interesting finding that there a small percentage actually are concerned. And of course, that might cash out differently if it was somebody who was born in India versus someone born in the US.
100%. I mean, I think there's two or three things to say on this. One of the consistent findings in the 3 waves of the survey going back to 2020 has been that when you ask people, what is the most important issue for you from an electoral sense in terms of deciding who you're going to vote for, kind of what's top of mind, U.S.-India relations is one of the least popular response options. Foreign policy, national security generally rate very poorly, right? I mean, somewhere in the low single digits in terms of percentage. You tend to have issues that are bread and butter issues which dominate kind of people's minds, right? So it's the economy, it's inflation, it's the price of things, it's, the employment situation, right? I mean, during COVID, there were people who really cared about the state of our healthcare system, the state of our education system, because a lot of kids weren't in school, right? And so that in some ways is not that surprising in the sense that, that's generally what most surveys of the American public find, right? I want to make a distinction here between something not being a critical electoral issue and something that people don't think is significant. I think Indians in America, by and large, do care about what's happening between the U.S. and India. I think, we've seen a lot of backlash towards this president because they believe that, he has not handled the bilateral relationship very well. But I think the kicker is that, when it comes to actually voting and how people cast their ballots, foreign policy, the relationship between the U.S. and India is not topmost of mind. Naturally, it is going to matter more for people who are not born in the United States or who are not citizens, in the same way, frankly, that immigration also is a much more pressing issue for people who are either came from India here, as opposed to someone like myself who was born in this country, or people who are not yet citizens, right? So the kind of salience of that issue is higher.
Yes, where the issues are very global now, right? With the tariffs, with the Indian citizens who were killed in America, global
I mean, and it's a function of
extradition.
our information environment, right? I mean, people have access to this stuff on social media, Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, on Facebook. And so, there's this kind of instant transmission of issues from one set to the other. I mean, just to give you a kind of concrete example of this, my hometown is Houston, Texas. That was the site of this historic 2019 rally, Howdy Modi, where the Indian diaspora was there to kind of welcome and celebrate Prime Minister Modi and his achievements. And Donald Trump was not originally part of the program, but became part of the program and became a kind of big to-do. And I remember talking to some of my parents' friends who have been living in Houston from a long time, immigrated from India, and many of them were quite excited that this was a big honor. They got to see the prime minister. Many of them were supporters of the prime minister. And what was interesting is looking at my own personal social media. Their kids, and in some cases their grandkids, were out front protesting Prime Minister Modi because they disagreed with his policies on Kashmir. They were not fans of changes to citizenship law and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so this is not a monolithic, community, right? I mean, this is really a community where people hold very diverse views.
Right. Yes, there's definitely a generational gap in terms of India's policies between the parents and the kids that were born here under a kind of more democratic regime, as you've said, they favored.
Yeah, and just like one final note is that you were asking me about how Indian Americans feel about the way Trump has handled relations with India. I think it's worth pointing out that, between kind of 25 to 30% of Indian Americans don't have an opinion on that question, right? So it suggests that this issue does have low salience for many Indian Americans. And I think if you disaggregate the data, what you will find is that question has much lower salience for people who are born in the United States and who haven't immigrated from India themselves.
Right. Absolutely. One other finding I wanted to talk to you about and hear more from you about is the idea of discrimination against Indian Americans. I know that there's been quite a lot of online discrimination and hate, just as an example, Satya Nadella, the president of Microsoft, celebrating the victory of the Seattle Seahawks and saying our own team, won. And then all of a sudden the vitriol that followed in his Twitter feed of, well, you're not from Seattle, go back to Hyderabad. That's just one example of the multitude of more disgusting comments that have been made online. But how did your survey capture that? And can you talk about what your findings are?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Here again, this was another, I think, a bit of a surprising finding in a couple of respects. So we have asked questions about people's perceptions of discrimination consistently across these three waves, right? So we've asked them essentially, in the past 12 months, have you felt that you have been a victim of discrimination? And if so, on what grounds, right? So it could be skin color, it could be country of origin, it could be your gender, it could be your caste identity, right? And we kind of give them a set of options. Now, what's interesting is that over these three surveys, there has been statistically zero change in people's first-person exposure to discrimination. It has stayed relatively constant across time, right? Which is pretty interesting, I think. It's not what we would have thought. We would have thought it would have ticked up in this most recent year, right? However, I don't want to suggest that means that, this isn't an issue, because one of the other things that we found is when we ask people whether or not they were experiencing or witnessing, I should say, this kind of online anti-Indian hate that you alluded to earlier with the Satya Nadella example. Around 50% of people report seeing this kind of stuff on social media, on the internet, often, right? So not everyone is highly online, but about 1 in 2 respondents see that. And then, the other kind of corollary to that is that while we may not be seeing a huge uptick in people's firsthand experiences with their own discrimination against themselves, it is nonetheless perhaps reshaping people's behavior, right? So a significant number of people report preemptively changing how they live, how they speak, how they participate in public life in order to avoid harassment, right? So a large number of people say, I don't want to post comments about politics online because I'm worried about getting doxxed, right? I might even be worried of wearing native Indian dress for, say, a Diwali celebration because that, paints me essentially someone who's different, right? I don't want to kind of put a yard sign in my house about my kind of political views because, that might be a dangerous thing to do. So, the reason I really worry about this is that, it's never a good sign when people are kind of preemptively kind of withdrawing from the public square, right? For fear that, engaging might have some really nasty outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, and I would argue, right, there's a direct connection between the online vitriol as well as the negative political environment for all immigrants in this country. Brown people are lumped into one category, as understandably we ought to be, we are, whatever the case may be. So there's a direct connection, right, between all of that and how people are reacting. And to me, that is a form of reaction to discrimination. It is a form of discrimination when you feel that you can't be yourself in a country, or you have to change your behavior or hide who you are to not get physically harassed.
Yeah, absolutely. And the analogy that I always think about, and this comes up in a lot of different contexts, increasingly, sadly, it's coming up in the United States context, is, we have this debate about censorship, right? We're seeing governments all over the world increasingly resort to all kinds of tools, legal, new laws, regulatory rules and provisions to kind of clamp down on speech. But in fact, in parallel, what we are seeing is people who are just, again, restricting what they say for fear of being penalized or punished, right? So in other words, it's not overt state censorship, but it is essentially self-censorship, right? And that is very pernicious, because where does that end? How do you even measure it, right? It's kind of like the dog that didn't bark, right? So it's like the editor who doesn't assign the news story, the person who doesn't post their view, the civil society, representative who doesn't decide to tackle an interesting corruption story because they're worried about what it might mean. I think I agree. I mean, that is we would call that a form of a kind of democratic deficit.
Yeah. And I think it's, doesn't bode well for the way we're going. And I certainly hope we can find ways to change it. And I think your survey, provides us the tools that we need to understand what the problems are. So I really appreciate that. One other thing I wanted to ask, what implications do you think the survey has for how perhaps political leaders should be messaging, what NGOs should be doing, what other constituencies do you think would be interested in these findings?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the political class, right? I mean, I think there are warning signs in this report, both for Democrats and for Republicans, right? I mean, again, if you look at Indian Americans historically, as I mentioned before, they are amongst the most kind of pro-democratic constituencies in America, right? So the way to kind of situate them, if you kind of look at different racial ethnic minorities in the United States are Black Americans tend to vote most heavily Democratic. Indians are somewhere between Black voters and Latino voters in terms of their propensity to vote for the Democratic Party, right? Now, of course, their numbers are relatively small. There are about 5 million people of Indian origin. Not all of them are citizens. But still, I think that's a very clear sign. But we're seeing, again, a kind of softening or weakening in their connection to the Democratic Party. And maybe a sense of unease about, what the Democratic Party stands for, who is the next generation leadership of the party. If you flip that for Republicans, this is a group that many conservatives have long felt belong in their camp. They look at Indian Americans and they say, look, these are people who have serious family values. Many of them are entrepreneurs. Many of them care about taxes, about regulation, about kind of fiscal issues. And they should really be voting for us. But we have not seen significant numbers of Indian Americans vote for the Republican Party. But we have seen a bit of a move towards Republicanism in the past couple of years. And that's very clear from 2020 to 2024. I think the Republican Party is at real risk of forfeiting those gains if they continue in the mode that they're currently in. I think we're already seeing a lot of disaffection with the turn the party has taken, just in the first year of the Trump administration. So I think those are the messages for the political class. I think for broader kind of civil society is, we hope that these results will provide a data point for them to also make the case to their civic, their community, their political leaders that, I think sometimes there is a belief that because Indian Americans have done so well in economic terms, they've done so well in career terms, they've integrated so well into the kind of American fabric that it really plays into this kind of model minority myth, right? But that has not insulated Indian Americans from being victims of discrimination and kind of anti-Indian targeting, right? And I think it's important for people to kind of make that point, because I think it's very easy to say, well, that's not really a problem. These are people who are doing well in society. And I think in many socioeconomic ways, they are doing well. But again, I think this is something to worry about. So I think those are some of the takeaways that we hope that people will take away from this report.
It's really fascinating and incredibly important report. We're grateful you did it. I noticed that you had a question also about the severity of the discrimination or the type of discrimination in this survey, but perhaps not in the prior surveys. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think decided to ask a slightly deeper set of questions on discrimination this time to try and kind of unpack the severity, the modes, the locations in which it was happening, just because I think it's an issue that's been on a lot of people's minds. The kind of blatant anti-Indian American racism we're seeing is pretty stark. And I think, just to kind of put a point on it, the reason I think it has worried so many people is not just, seeing this in plain black and white. It is that many political leaders are refusing to condemn that kind of language, right? Or refusing to disassociate their political colleagues, their political supporters, right? And so I think there's a feeling that a lot of people are frankly just kind of looking the other way. And I think that gives people a lot of pause. There's clearly some relationship between trajectory of U.S.-India relations and the degree to which Indians have become a target, right? I mean, it is hard to nail that down in a kind of causal sense, but I think the attacks on immigration, the criticism of the H-1B visa program, the tariffs that we're seeing, all of that sort of said, Indians are problematic in some way, right? I mean, they were kind of disproportionately singled out or felt disproportionately singled out. And I think that did have, my own hypothesis is that it had spillover effects in terms of ordinary social interactions.
So, yeah, I think really, really interesting. Again, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time, particularly given the time zone differences. that we have. It's been a great conversation.
No, thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk to you.
Surveys like these are essential because it moves beyond anecdotes and assumptions and gets us real data-driven evidence on what the Indian community is experiencing in America today. The results of this survey have really important implications for politics, economics, and social movements in the United States, and I hope everyone has a chance to read it in full. If you enjoyed this episode of The Hyphen, please like and share it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you to our producers, Ashini Jagtiani, Shannon Young, and Social Sherpa. I also wanted to give a big thanks to our media partner, India Abroad.